The morning looks ordinary at first, the kind of quiet that feels familiar without asking for attention. Soft light spreading across a backyard in suburban America, touching the edges of a wooden fence, resting on patches of grass still holding the coolness of night. And somewhere in that stillness there is movement, subtle, almost invisible, a faint rustle near the trees where sparrows usually gather. But today the branches seem lighter, almost unfinished, as if something expected has already stepped away without leaving a sound behind. You notice it only in fragments, the absence of flutter where there should be motion, the feeder swaying slightly but without the usual cluster of wings, and even the air feels different, less interrupted, as though the space itself forgot how to fill itself with life for a moment. A distant cardinal call breaks through, then stops mid-pattern, leaving a silence that feels too structured to be random, too clean to ignore. And it is in moments like this that you start to wonder if you are simply noticing something you have always missed. If you are new here, take a second and gently subscribe before you move on, because what unfolds from this point is not just about birds, but about something far quieter and harder to see, something that changes the way you understand what presence and absence really mean. But that realization does not settle yet. It just lingers in the edges of perception like a thought you cannot fully complete. And then you notice it again. No movement near the fence line where pigeons usually gather, no sudden lift of wings from the ground, just space holding itself unusually still, and somehow that stillness feels less like peace and more like something paused mid-breath. But that is only the beginning of what this silence is trying to tell you, because what happens next is not about what you see, but about what you slowly realize is no longer there. It is strange how quickly the mind tries to correct what the eyes cannot fully explain, as if uncertainty itself is something that needs to be fixed before it becomes uncomfortable. And standing there in the soft morning light, you almost feel that instinct rise without permission, the way it always does when something familiar suddenly becomes slightly unfamiliar. You tell yourself it is nothing, just a quieter morning, just bird shifting patterns, just nature doing what it always does. But even as you think it, there is a subtle resistance underneath the thought, like a second layer of awareness refusing to fully agree. And maybe you have felt this before without ever naming it. Those moments when a familiar place feels briefly misaligned, like walking into a room and forgetting why it feels different, even though nothing has visibly changed, or stepping outside and noticing that the usual background sounds are not quite forming the same pattern they used to. Researchers studying perception often describe this as the brain detecting small deviations in environmental rhythm before conscious awareness catches up, a kind of early warning system built into attention itself. But what science does not fully capture is the emotional texture of it, that quiet pause where you are not sure if something is wrong or if you are simply noticing more than usual. And in that space, something very human happens. You start searching for confirmation, looking toward the fence line, the branches, the feeder, expecting the usual patterns to reassemble themselves into something recognizable. You have probably had mornings like this before, without realizing how often they pass unnoticed, where the world is technically unchanged but feels slightly unperformed, as if the usual participants have not yet arrived for a scene you did not consciously agree to watch. And in those moments, you begin to wonder if this feeling is something personal or something shared, because there is a strange comfort in believing that others might have felt it too, that you are not the only one who has stood in a quiet backyard and sensed a shift they could not immediately explain. And if you are here listening right now, there is a good chance you know exactly what that feels like, that subtle hesitation between observation and interpretation, where you are not looking for anything specific but somehow still expecting meaning to surface from the silence itself. But that is where things begin to deepen, because once you start noticing the absence of pattern instead of just the presence of things, the entire way you perceive this space begins to change. And what seemed like an ordinary morning starts to feel like it is holding something just beneath the surface of attention. As you continue standing in that quiet backyard, something subtle begins to shift in the way you interpret what you are seeing, as if your attention is slowly adjusting to a layer of reality that was always there but never fully acknowledged. And now every small detail feels slightly more intentional than before. The fence line no longer feels like just a boundary of wood and nails, but a stage where movement usually happens in predictable rhythms. Yet today, those rhythms feel interrupted in ways that are not immediately visible but still strongly felt. You notice the feeder hanging stiller than usual, not because it is not moving at all, but because the usual pattern of brief, Repeated interruptions from wings and landing feet is missing, and that absence begins to feel like its own kind of signal. Somewhere deeper in awareness, there is a quiet realization forming that what you usually perceive as a yard full of birds is actually a constantly shifting system of arrivals, departures, and unseen transitions that rarely hold still long enough to be consciously tracked. And when you start thinking about it this way, a strange idea begins to surface, that perhaps nothing here is ever truly gone in the way you assume, but instead constantly moving just outside the edges of what you happen to notice at any given moment. Ornithologists who study backyard ecosystems often describe this as a continuous turnover effect, where individuals are always being replaced faster than human attention can register, creating the illusion of stability even when the actual population is in constant motion. But hearing it in theory is very different from standing in it, because what you feel in this moment is not data or explanation, but a quiet expansion of perception, as if the space itself is revealing a hidden layer of activity that never required your awareness to continue existing. You might even find yourself scanning more slowly now, not looking for anything specific, but simply trying to sense what else might be happening just beyond recognition, and in that subtle shift of attention, the yard stops feeling like a simple outdoor space and starts feeling more like a system you were never fully seeing all at once. And it is in that shift that something deeper begins to emerge, not a clear answer, but a growing sense that what you call normal has always depended on how much you happen to notice at any given moment, and that realization quietly opens the door to something you were not expecting to consider so early in this experience. And then, almost without noticing when it begins, your mind starts trying to explain what your senses have already accepted as unusual, as if the brain itself cannot tolerate uncertainty without building a structure around it, even if that structure is invisible. You remember reading somewhere that perception is not a direct recording of reality, but a constant reconstruction, a prediction system that fills in gaps based on patterns it has learned over time, and in moments like this, that idea stops feeling abstract and starts feeling personal. Because what you are experiencing in this quiet yard is not the presence of something dramatic, but the absence of expected rhythm, and absence is something the human mind is strangely sensitive to, even when it cannot immediately define what is missing. In studies of animal behavior, especially in urban ornithology, researchers often describe how bird activity follows highly predictable micro-patterns tied to light, temperature, and human routine, where even small deviations in environmental cues can shift movement across an entire area without any obvious central cause. A sudden reduction in visible bird presence, for example, does not necessarily mean disappearance in the literal sense, but often reflects a redistribution triggered by subtle changes in perceived risk, resource availability, or environmental signals that operate below human awareness. And yet, even knowing that, it does not fully resolve the feeling you are having, because explanation does not always dissolve perception, it simply sits alongside it. You begin to understand that what feels like emptiness might actually be activity happening just outside the threshold of visibility, where motion continues but no longer intersects with your line of sight at the right moment. Some researchers even suggest that human observers consistently underestimate biological activity in familiar environments by a significant margin, not because the activity is rare, but because attention is selective and memory is reconstructive. And so the yard remains, unchanged in structure, fence still aligned, grass still present, feeder still hanging in its usual place. Yet, something about how it is being interpreted in your mind has shifted slightly, as if a hidden layer of logic has been quietly overlaid onto what you thought you already understood. And in that space between explanation and experience, a new kind of awareness begins to form, one that does not fully replace mystery, but instead makes it feel more grounded, more possible, and harder to ignore. At some point, without you consciously deciding to do so, your attention begins to settle into the yard in a different way, not scanning, not searching, but simply resting on small details as if they are starting to matter more than they usually would. The way the fence post catches a thin line of morning light. The way a single leaf moves slightly even when the air feels still. The faint sound of something distant, possibly wings, possibly just wind, passing through branches too high to see clearly. And you realize that you are no longer only observing the space, but beginning to feel it in fragments, as if each small element carries a kind of weight it did not have before. There is a moment when your eyes rest on the feeder again, and instead of seeing it as an object, you notice the space around it, the emptiness that frames it, the absence of the usual interruptions that once made it feel active and alive. And strangely, that absence does not feel empty anymore. It feels structured, almost intentional, like a pattern that only becomes visible when something within it changes. You might not even realize it at first, but your breathing slows slightly as you stand there, as if your body is syncing itself to the quiet instead of resisting it. And that subtle shift makes everything feel closer, more immediate. It is in these small, almost invisible moments that connection begins to form, not through explanation or understanding, but through repeated observation of things that seem too minor to matter until they start accumulating meaning. You notice how the light shifts across the grass in a way you had never paid attention to before, how shadows stretch and retract slowly across the yard like they are marking time in a language you are only now beginning to notice. And somewhere in that quiet awareness, there is a soft recognition that you are no longer separate from what you are seeing, but gently included in it, as if the boundary between observer and environment has softened just enough to let something pass through. Nothing dramatic has changed, nothing has revealed itself fully, but everything feels slightly more present, and that presence, quiet and unspoken, is what makes you stay a little longer without knowing exactly why. There is a point, almost unnoticed, where observation stops being passive and starts becoming something heavier, as if the space you are looking at begins to respond not with movement, but with presence. The backyard is still the same in structure, the fence, the feeder, the uneven patches of grass shaped by seasons of weather, yet the way you perceive it now carries a subtle intensity, like something is happening just outside the edges of what you can directly confirm. You find yourself pausing longer between thoughts, not because you are searching for anything specific, but because the silence itself feels layered, no longer empty, but filled with something unspoken. And in that layered quiet, your awareness begins to stretch further than usual, noticing not only what is there, but what consistently is not. No sudden flocks breaking the air, no scattered movement between branches, no familiar interruptions that once marked time in small, forgettable ways. It is not that everything has stopped, but that the usual rhythm of life here has become harder to detect, as if the signals you relied on to understand this space are now occurring outside your immediate perception. Scientists studying ecological behavior often describe how small environmental systems do not truly pause, but shift in distribution, where activity moves vertically into canopy layers, laterally into unseen distances, or temporally into moments that no longer align with human observation patterns. Yet hearing that explanation does not reduce the sensation you feel now, because what you are experiencing is not intellectual confusion, but a quiet expansion of scale, as if the backyard is no longer just a place you are standing in, but part of a larger system continuing far beyond what your senses can currently map. And in that realization, there is a strange kind of humility, not emotional, but perceptual, like you are being gently reminded that visibility is not the same as presence. The longer you stand there, the more the silence begins to feel less like absence and more like distribution. Something spread out rather than missing, something ongoing rather than paused. And just as that thought begins to settle, you notice a faint, almost imperceptible shift near the tree line, not enough to define, not enough to confirm, but enough to make you realize that what you think is still missing might not actually be gone at all. At this stage, the quiet no longer feels like something that simply surrounds you, but something that extends beyond the yard itself, as if the absence of movement has started to gain a kind of meaning that is difficult to place into ordinary thought. You are still standing in the same spot, the same patch of ground beneath your feet, yet the experience of it has subtly shifted, like the boundary between observation and interpretation has grown thinner, without you noticing when it happened. The tree line no longer feels like just a physical edge of the property, but more like a threshold into something you are not fully seeing, and the longer you look, the more that threshold seems to hold its own quiet weight. In studies of animal behavior, there are observations that when environmental conditions change even slightly, entire populations of birds do not vanish, but redistribute across vertical layers of habitat, shifting into higher canopy levels or deeper cover where human perception becomes less effective at tracking them. And while that explanation makes logical sense, it does not fully dissolve the feeling that is settled in now. Because what you are sensing is not just absence, but the impression that something is continuing just outside the frame of your awareness. Many people believe that moments like this carry more meaning than they appear to on the surface, not because there is a clear answer hidden within them, but because they interrupt the usual certainty with which we assume we are seeing the full picture. There is something about this kind of quiet that feels difficult to ignore, as if it is not asking for interpretation, but simply asking to be noticed without conclusion. You might find yourself thinking less about what is missing and more about what is still present but not immediately visible, and that shift alone changes the way the entire space feels. The yard is no longer just a familiar environment with predictable life patterns, but something closer to a living system whose full activity you are only partially able to perceive at any given moment. And in that recognition, there is a soft uncertainty that does not feel alarming, but instead strangely contemplative, as if the natural world has always been slightly larger than the version of it you were paying attention to. And just as that thought begins to settle, the silence around the tree line feels like it deepens once more, not in volume, but in presence, leaving you with the sense that what you are trying to understand has not ended here, but is still unfolding just beyond what you can clearly see. At this point, there is nothing new happening in any visible way, and yet the experience of standing there feels completely different from when you first stepped outside, as if the same environment has quietly shifted its emotional tone without altering its physical form. The yard remains still, the fence unchanged, the feeder hanging in the same position it has always been. But your attention no longer moves across it in search of activity, it simply rests, as though it has accepted that what is happening here is not meant to be resolved quickly. The silence is no longer something you are trying to interpret, it is something you are beginning to sit with, and in that shift, even the smallest details feel more pronounced, like the slow movement of light across the grass or the faint shadow passing through distant branches that may or may not be from anything you can clearly identify. There is a kind of quiet acceptance forming now, not of answers, but of uncertainty itself, as if the need to fill every gap with explanation has softened for a moment and left space for something more observational. You start to realize how rarely you actually experience a space like this without mentally labeling it, without turning it into something functional or known, and in that realization, the yard becomes less of a setting and more of a presence you are sharing time with rather than simply observing. Many people describe this kind of stillness as peaceful, but there is something more subtle here, something closer to awareness without urgency, where time does not feel stopped, but stretched just enough to notice its texture. And in that stretched moment, you are no longer thinking about what is missing or what should be happening. You are simply aware that you are here, and that this quiet has been here longer than your thoughts about it. Nothing resolves, nothing arrives, and yet everything feels slightly more complete in its stillness, as if the absence you first noticed has gradually transformed into something you can no longer separate from the space itself, leaving only a lingering sense that being present here has become enough without needing anything to happen at all. By the time you begin to turn away, the backyard no longer feels like a place you were trying to understand, but something you have quietly shared time with, as if both you and it have settled into a mutual recognition that does not require explanation. The silence is still there, unchanged in form, yet completely different in how it lives inside your awareness, no longer pressing for interpretation, no longer asking to be solved, only existing with a kind of calm certainty that feels almost heavier than sound. You glance once more toward the tree line, expecting nothing and receiving nothing, and somehow that absence feels complete rather than unfinished, as if the question you carried outside with you has dissolved not because it was answered, but because it was no longer necessary. There is a subtle release in that realization, not dramatic, not sudden, but gradual, like something inside you letting go of the need to fill every gap with meaning. And in that quiet release, the yard returns to being just a yard again. Yet you are no longer the same in how you see it, because something about attention itself has shifted slightly, leaving behind the awareness that not everything hidden is gone, and not everything unseen is absent. You take a slow breath, almost without thinking, and the air feels ordinary again, but in a way that now carries depth instead of emptiness. Then you begin to step away, not because anything has ended, but because it has already settled into something you cannot fully name, something that does not follow you, yet does not entirely stay behind either. If you have stayed until this moment, thank you for being here through this quiet experience, because stories like this are not really about what is seen, but about what remains with us after we stop looking. If you find meaning in these kinds of reflections, gently consider subscribing before you leave, not as a request, but as an invitation to continue exploring these subtle spaces where nature, perception, and awareness quietly overlap, because there are still many moments in the world that most people pass by without ever noticing. And as you move on from this place, there is a lingering sense that the world has not become smaller or clearer, only deeper in ways that do not reveal themselves all at once. And perhaps somewhere out there, even now, another ordinary silence is waiting for someone to finally notice that it was never truly empty at all.